Hello, welcome to the Self-Learning Podcast by Dr. Sushma Singh. Let us start discussion on Unit 13, Evolution, Development and Function of Capitalism. And our topic is Expansion of Markets and Production. A further precondition for the development of capitalism is the expansion of the market. Pre-capitalist small-scale commodity production works for a limited market. In the 16th century, a commercial revolution took place in Europe. Discoveries of the new trade routes opened the Vasco da Gama era of worldwide trade under colonial conditions. The expansion of the market encouraged large-scale production and thus the growth of capitalism. The capitalist entrepreneurs can emerge only when a certain scale of production has been reached. The guild master and his limited number of journeymen and apprentices do not produce enough for setting the master free to do only the directing and supervising work. The capitalist as director of an enterprise emerges with the scale of production growing larger. Let us move to the next point, the production of surplus value. With the market for commodity production expanding and with a minimum of capital in the hands of a class of owners of the means of production, and with a sufficient number of workers ready to be hired on the labor market, capitalist production can develop. Once it has gathered momentum, it has its own internal dynamism to expand further and further. Marx calls it the restless, never-ending process of profit making. How does it work? The key answer of Marx is his theory of production of surplus value. For Marx, the extraction of unpaid surplus labor is the key to understand the different forms of society. Rent paid to the landlord in feudal society, taxes paid to the state in Asiatic society. These forms are connected with the different political structures needed to enforce this extraction. In capitalist society, the appropriation of surplus value happens in a new way. It is no longer the unpaid labor of slaves or serfs, but the unpaid labor of wage laborers. Workers in capitalist society receive wages. It seems they are paid for their work. That is the great mystification in capitalism, which covers up the process of exploitation. Actually, they are paid not for their work, but for the use of their labor power. What they produce is worth more than their wages. The wages cover only the cost of necessary labor, that what is needed to maintain the laborer. The value of what he produces is more than that. The capitalist appropriates the difference. What is the surplus? This is possible because labor power is a commodity which can be brought on the market. Now let us move to the next point, the never-ending process of profit making. Capitalist tries to increase the rate of surplus value all the time. Now we raise the question why the capitalist has to be involved in such a restless manner in profit making. This can be attributed to the unlimited greed which is fostered by capitalism. But this greed should not be understood in a moralistic manner, but as capitalist. The process of accumulating capital will continue, otherwise they go bankrupt. This pressure comes from the competition between the individual capitalists, which are characteristic of capitalism. If a capitalist does not invest in new technology, if he does not expand production, others will move ahead and conquer the market, and he will be left out in the cold. He cannot appropriate profit for his own consumption only, or spend it just for some unproductive purposes. He must take part of it and put it aside for reinvestment. That part becomes new additional capital. Thus, he has to accumulate capital. This implies the trend towards the concentration of capital in large-scale production. This concentration again becomes the basis for the centralization of the ownership and control of capital in the hands of a few. The market is like the jungle with its law of survival of the fittest. The general tendency is towards the elimination of the similar ones, to the centralization of capital. The bigger capitalists grow bigger and fewer. We now consider what effect the law of accumulation of capital has on labor. Accumulation of capital means an increased demand for labor power. This could lead to a rise in the price of labor. On a modest scale, wages may rise for a while, but this does not change the basic position of the laborer, who is completely dependent on the capitalist. Capitalism does not only create demand for labor, it also creates unemployment through the process of mechanization. In this way, it creates an industrial reserve army of the unemployed, whose existence makes it possible for the capitalist to keep the wages of the employed under control. The action of the law of supply and demand of labor on this basis completes the despotism of capital. There is another reason why the capitalist has to expand production unlimited. In the process of accumulation of capital, the proportion of constant capital increases and becomes greater in relation to variable capital. This is called the growth in the organic composition of capital. Since the constant capital increases in the process of mechanization and the part of surplus value producing variable capital becomes relatively less, Marx assumes a tendency of the average rate of profit to decline. The more a capitalist expands, the lower his rate of profit becomes. He can only make good for it by expanding the scale of production. But the ever-increasing expansion of capitalist production leads to inevitably to an economic crisis. That is the other law of capitalism which Marx establishes. These crises are the result of the basic contradiction between capital and labor. In order to survive, capital must accumulate and expand, and its expanding mass production, it must find masses of buyers. These masses consist to a large extent of workers. They can only buy if they receive higher wages. But higher wages reduce the capitalist's rate of profit. Every individual capitalist therefore would like to keep his own workers poor and to see the rest of the workers rich enough to buy his products. Now let us wind up the session and take rest. Thank you very much for engaging yourself with the self-learning podcast.